So good evening, everyone. My name is Nicole Milano, and I want to thank you for joining us in person. To those of you who are braving the weather today to join us here in person and online for tonight's lecture with Dr. Christopher Willoughby. We welcome participation from all attendees in our question and answer session following today's talk. For attendees online, you'll find a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen where you can enter a question, and we'll get to as many as possible following the lecture tonight. Online attendees should also know that closed captioning is currently enabled if you have the updated version of Zoom. You can find the option at the bottom of your screen to turn the captioning on or off during tonight's lecture. Now, the Heberden Society is a history of medicine lecture series held at Weill Cornell Medicine since 1975, and I would like to thank the Office of the Dean for continuing to support the series. I'm excited to share for the first time this evening that we'll have 3 additional lectures this academic year. Our next lecture will be with Aya Nuruddin presenting Seed and Soil, Black Eugenic Thought in the 19th and early 20th centuries on November 7th at 5 p.m. On March 19th at 5 p.m., Jeremy Brown will be sharing insights from his most recent book on the Jewish pandemic experience. And finally, on April 17th at 1 p.m., note the change in time, Beatrix Hoffman will share the impact current and past immigration policies have had on immigrant health outcomes. I will be sending out more information about these lectures following tonight's presentation. As usual, all lectures are hybrid, free, and open to the public, so please join. Now, for those of you who are interested in the history of the New York Presbyterian Weill Cornell Medical Center, I would invite you to conduct research in our very own medical center archives. The archives includes materials dating back to 1771, including this program from the first medical college graduation in 1899. You can find more than 14,000 photographs and documents from our collections digitized and available online through the link seen here. Many more are available through on-site research appointments, which we're happy to coordinate for those who are interested. So are you ready for changing leaves, pumpkin spice, and all things fall? If so, members of the Weill Cornell and New York Presbyterian communities can get into the fall spirit with us through a themed journey highlighting the history of the medical center on October 31st. The Medical Center Archives is offering this tour at 2 separate times, 11 a.m. and 3 p.m., and you'll find the registration link available through the community and news listservs. Now, finally, I would like to introduce you to Dr. Christopher Willoughby, a historian of medicine and slavery in the United States. Dr. Willoughby received his doctorate from Tulane University and now teaches African American and African diaspora studies in the Interdisciplinary, Gender, and Ethnic Studies Department at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. He has received grants and fellowships from a variety of organizations, including Harvard University and the Schoenberg Center for Research in Black Culture. His current research includes a forthcoming monograph entitled Collected Without Consent, A Global History of Harvard Medical School's Racial Skulls. In 2021, he co-edited Medicine and Healing in the Age of Slavery, and in 2022 published Masters of Health, Racial Science and Slavery in U.S. Medical Schools, which will serve in part as the subject matter for tonight's talk. Welcome, Dr. Willoughby.
Good evening, and I do want to echo the archives are amazing here. I spent 3 hours this morning there and am plotting my hopefully triumphant return and a new little side project. They're really rich with history of African Americans. I already just in 3 hours found a lot in New York City in the early 19th century. Thank you all for coming. Thanks to Nicole Milano and the Heberden Society for inviting me here tonight. Before I get into my talk, though, I do want to give a little bit of a content warning. My talk engages with themes such as medical racism, suicide, violent subjugation, and includes terms really just in quotes, though, on the slides that are outdated, although not necessarily racial slurs per se. With that said, I'm glad for the opportunity to tell you more about my findings in the history of slavery and medicine, slavery and racial science in U.S. medical schools, in particular, how this played out in Manhattan in the first half of the 19th century. I'll do so first by discussing an individual story of how medical professionals' embrace of racial science affected diverse lives. The story then acts as a segue to describing how medical schools became the central site for the dissemination of racial science in the United States in the last decades of chattel slavery. Then I'll consider two anecdotes from New York City about the dissection of stolen bodies from the Black community and how the public reacted to these thefts and dissection. And then for the rest of the talk, I'm going to look at actually how race was taught in medical schools, with a specific emphasis on the notion that there were anatomical racial differences that are permanent, real in this premise, and could be used to organize American society into racial hierarchies. But before I get into all of that, I want to start with the history of Stormont as a window into the intimate effects of antebellum racial science. Stormont was born in Little Namaqualand near the border of contemporary South Africa and Namibia. And you can see a map of Namaqualand. And up near where you see that river at the top of the map, that's where Little Namaqualand is, right around the Orange River. So it's on the Atlantic coast of South Africa. But by the time he arrived in Boston in 1860, Stormont was 16 years old. Already he had experienced a chaotic life, dispossessed of their grazing lands from settler colonialism. As a child, Stormont and his family hunted and gathered for food in the shadows of Dutch Boer settlements. As a teenager, Stormont trekked more than 1,000 miles from the Atlantic coast to the Indian Ocean coast city of Natal, and worked there for some time that we know as a hunting guide for white hunting parties. After that, Stormont made another desperate decision. He came to Boston in search of a better life. Instead, though, he ended up in a P.T. Barnum exhibit. And this exhibit was at first the Boston Aquarial Gardens, and also he went on tour to various sites around the United States, particularly one of them being Barnum's American Museum in Lower Manhattan. And we can see this broadside here from the exhibit. Stormont was displayed with 4 other men from South Africa, or Southern Africa, and that is a obviously very offensive, but depiction of him on the extreme side there. On display with 4 other men from Southern Africa, Stormont was forced to portray stereotypes of African indigeneity. Every day he had to perform what exhibitors called the war and love dances, while holding clubs and spears, as you can see here. In less than a year in the United States, Stormont hanged himself. The story sent shockwaves through the press, from Boston to New York City and into the Midwest. Only 6 months earlier, newspapers had been attempting to justify the exhibit, claiming that the arrangement between the promoters and the British government in South Africa was nothing like the slave trade. And if you haven't put together the timeline, this is right in the middle of the secession crisis. This trade was then particularly awkward for Northerners who were trying to distance themselves from slavery and had just elected the first anti-slavery president. Left out of newspapers was how Stormont's body was given to Harvard's medical school, where they turned his remains into a teaching tool and supposed evidence of racial difference. And I have these blank slides because some of these images are somewhat, frankly offensive. So I don't see a reason to leave them up unnecessarily long. It's critical to understand that Stormont's tragic suicide, though, may not have been just a case of desperation. Unlike Christianity, Southern African religions and syncretic forms of Christianity that were formed in the African diaspora did not view suicide as inherently immoral. And thus, he may have been seeking a better life in the afterlife. More broadly, the history of Stormont reminds us of the profound cost of creating and disseminating racial theories. 19th century medical students learned supposed racial differences on bodies of people like Stormont. Scientists at Harvard measured and made casts of his remains. He was an unwilling participant in the production of 19th century racial science. Moreover, collections of people's remains brought prestige and scientific legitimacy to medicine and the allied sciences. Stormont's life, then, is as much a part of the history of medicine as are accounts of antebellum faculty, like Joseph Leidy at the University of Pennsylvania, John Collins Warren at Harvard University, or John Augustin Smith of the New York College of Physicians and Surgeons, or Columbia Medical School. My book then captures captures titanic shifts in the history of American medical education, spanning from only one medical school in 1765. Columbia's is founded 2 years after, to their chagrin, and to over 50 medical schools at the start of the Civil War. During this period, physicians like Declaration of Independence signer, Penn professor, and abolitionist, and also racial theorist Benjamin Rush could truly believe that chattel slavery was in decline. This was, of course, just before the invention of the modern cotton gin, when the cotton boom would occur and slavery would then accelerate in expanding through the Western Old Southwest, we would call it, as historians call it. So by this point, after the 1790s, the US both had an actively growing slave system, but also a growing abolitionist movement. And this causes titanic national and Atlantic debates over the nature of race and the abolition of slavery, of course, culminating in the United States in the Civil War. So in my book, I make three key arguments. First, as white allopathic physicians faced a crisis of public confidence in the middle of the 19th century, doctors embraced medical schools, but also biodeterminist racial theories as a means to establish their legitimacy and social utility in a competitive medical marketplace with alternative healers. Thus, we could say that racial thinking partially underwrote the professionalization of medicine in the United States. Second, the proliferation of medical schools allowed physicians to lay claim to being a national profession with a shared ideology. And this will, I think, unfold very clearly in the talk what the relevance of that point is. By the end of the antebellum era, a whole generation of physicians emerged that were trained to see racial differences as real and anatomical in nature. Racial groups, students learned, were also suited to and healthy for specific environments. This has obvious utility for justifying slavery. Thus, faculty got to argue that racial difference was anatomically ordained, and the subtropics were uniquely healthy for people of African descent. Third, unpacking life stories of people like Stormont, whose skulls were displayed at Harvard, reveals that US racial medicine can only be understood through a transnational and really international lens that captures the breadth of the African diaspora. Even before slavery was abolished, medical racial theories were connected to and being applied to the potential colonization of Cuba, Liberia, and other parts of the global tropics. Medical schools then serve as a critical site for the dissemination of these racial theories, and revealing how early American physicians created a culture of racial theorizing. I also analyzed the relationship between schools and diverse Black communities in the United States and abroad, from New York City to South Africa. Here it's worth pointing out some general context that we need to understand. First, compared to the 18th century, when Columbia's medical school was founded, US medical schools only issue a little more than 200 degrees in the first 35 years of medical education. But from 1840 to 1859, they produce almost 30,000 MDs. During this period, schools will proliferate in the South, Midwest, and in the Northeast. We won't get our first West Coast school until after the Civil War, though. Second, few Black people were admitted to medical schools during this period. James McCune Smith, pictured here, was a native New Yorker born into slavery in Manhattan in 1813, but he'd have to go to Glasgow to become the first Black man with an MD. Smith had been denied admittance to the New York College of Physicians and Surgeons and the Geneva Medical College, which was also in New York State, before leaving the country and completing his degree in 1837. As an active abolitionist afterwards, he used his medical training to serve as an expert witness on racial difference for enslaved people trying to sue for freedom on the basis that they were not Black. On the other hand, the first actual Black graduate of a US medical school, Samuel F. McGill, had already emigrated to Liberia when he returned to the United States to become the first official graduate of an American medical school, that being Dartmouth, and in 1839. Should also note that early state licensing actively excluded Black practitioners as well. Third, During the 1840s and 1850s, when the story culminates, at least for the first time, obviously we'll have a lot of racial reckonings in this country's history, American scientists increasingly embraced the theory of polygenesis, that each race was a distinct species created for separate environments and separate continents. This immediately precedes the Darwinian revolution. Prior to this, most physicians were what were called monogenesists and believed that all humans derived from Adam and Eve and were the same species. After the Darwinian revolution, though, begins in 1859, the anatomical traits that polygenesists outline will be incorporated into a Darwinian racial framework. So a lot of the ideas will persist even as the framework is left behind. Finally, a key piece of my evidence is medical student dissertations. These are really different from a modern dissertation that emphasizes original research. Medical student dissertations were often very derivative, intentionally so, about a kind of mainstream topic like cholera or yellow fever. And often they were even plagiarized. And they were so bad to the point to where one physician in the 1870s, who's a professor at the Jefferson Medical College, suggested an annual ritual burning of all the medical student dissertations to celebrate the 4th of July. So they really did not hold these in high esteem. But the point of this is that for a historian, if you want to learn what the mainstream ideas about medicine were and how students kind of imbibed them, these dissertations are critical. And I'll discuss some of them later in the talk. For the mostly white students attending medical schools, their education was practical. They learned medicine through working on the bodies of Black people, immigrants, and the impoverished. Most critically, in the everyday operations of the medical school, students and faculty routinely stole the bodies of Black and other marginalized people. Dissection at this point was seen as a critical rite of passage. It steeled the doctor for surgery. They intentionally cultivated detachment from patients for this purpose, which was then compounded upon by the stereotypes being produced by racial scientists. For Southern schools like Hampton-Sydney College in Virginia or the Medical College of South Carolina, they overtly stated that the enslaved population was key to supplying their dissection rooms. This was not a secret, it's in their promotional literature. Dissection also engendered resistance among the free Black populations. In an anonymous editorial in a New York paper in the 1780s, one free Black man threatened students with death if they entered their cemetery. Medical schools and their body snatchers had been causing riots since the first medical schools were founded in the United States. Perhaps the most famous, though, happened in New York City in 1788, when an armed crowd numbering perhaps 5,000 people stormed and sieged the city jail, which was holding and protecting medical students. Accounts differ as to what exactly sparked the crowd. As I mentioned earlier, Black New Yorkers had been complaining about body snatching for some time, but this was not over the body of a Black person. And that explains this kind of large riot. Specifically, what we think happened is that out of a window at City Hospital, students waved the severed arm of a deceased white woman at passersby. In a city where slavery was still legal, Black people often challenged medical racism, but they had to do so much more subtly. Archaeological study of the 18th century African burial ground, which is now at roughly the site of the Federal Building in Lower Manhattan, actually reveals some information about how Black people, or to the extent that Black people did challenge medical professionals. And you can see this is a drawing of a specific site that was unearthed that shows this. Specifically, the top of the head right here was sawed off, which is something that pretty much would only happen in a post-mortem examination of some sorts. And so the archaeologists came to the conclusion that in some way, Black people must have confronted medical professionals. And because we don't really have records of them giving bodies back to anybody. They don't want to publicly discuss this. So the Black New Yorkers found body snatching an important issue to coalesce around, revealed to the degree to which the burial ground was a vital space for community formation among New York's African diasporic community. Despite the diversity of ethnic backgrounds among New York's African-descended population, the burial ground revealed a remarkably unified culture in terms of interment. African-descended communities formed shared cultures out of their different ethnic groups once they lived together and were on the ground. The vast majority of Black New Yorkers buried in the 18th century were placed in coffins and shrouds. Their bodies were laid supine on their backs with their heads facing west. Archaeologists think this is in line with Islamic principles. There's a large Muslim West African population in the city. Likewise, until the city's Common Council outlawed the practice in 1722, most burials took place at night and would have resembled, as close as we can say, something like a New Orleans jazz funeral, but totally different in some ways, but that is the closest modern analog we have in the US. The ordinance also revealed this banning of night burials, that elite whites feared burial grounds. So the attack represents both a kind of pragmatic need for bodies, with Black people being at the bottom of the social order, but also a literal kind of spiritual disciplinary attack on this community. At least that's how they saw it. While Black people challenged the exploitation of their community members' bodies by physicians, confrontation was not always possible. A notable example was the public dissection of Joyce Heth. During the 8 months prior to her death on February 19th, 1836, Heth had been touring around the United States, being marketed as a supposedly 161-year-old wet nurse of George Washington. While most believe P.T. Barnum's claims about Heth were bunk, medical professionals did see a route to improving their reputation through participating in his spectacle, particularly an autopsy of Heth's corpse to see if his claims about her age were true. We should note that just as critical as how Heth was toured around the country was this dissection, which Barnum turned into a massive event. And here we can see the Barnum Museum in Lower Manhattan. On February 25th, 1836 at noon, P.T. Barnum, Columbia's professor of surgery, David L. Rogers, and approximately 1,500 spectators paying 50 cents each gathered around the city saloon, which is located next to the museum. So probably around here, what we're looking at. And they were drawn there to watch Rogers perform a thorough autopsy of Heth's body. Unsurprisingly, Barnum's claims were false, as Rogers proved. Rather than a problem for Barnum, though, this was not even free. This was profitable publicity. He made more than $700 that day on the dissection. Can also see that a lot of this publicity will, they also received ample free publicity as journalists reported on the event and commenters debated Rogers' findings for months afterwards. This is so 7 months after her dissection, they're still even recounting the way she was toured around. They say Aunt Joyce and her exhibitors were now on their way to New York. As she was bundled up in the railroad cars, people gazed, wondered, and looked, and some laughed. Her exhibitors were the gravest man in the world. Seldom smiled, seldom decomposed. So on the one hand, they kind of see something disgusting about the people involved in Heth's exploitation, even as they are profiting mightily from that exploitation themselves. So this is an image made by newspapers. See those long fingers? She was infamous for having these long fingernails. But this is a woman who was enslaved her entire life on death's door, being toured around by America's biggest huckster. They don't show that in that Greatest Show on Earth film, but this is how P.T. Barnum got his start. Rather than defaming the medical profession by participating in this farce, the Columbia professor Rogers participated to contribute to its prestige. As scholar Benjamin Reese explains, Rogers had participated in several public dissections prior to and after this in order to convince lay people of the importance of anatomy in the advancement of science. And because bodies were illegal to obtain, technically speaking, outside of the executed, dissection was practically speaking illegal, but happened all the time. In short, public dissections such as this were meant to prove the value of physicians' dissecting practices, even in a period when it was illegal to procure cadavers outside of those executed. In 1788, and in other cities across the country thereafter, Communities rioted when a white body was found stolen, but 1,500 gawkers paid to see Heth dissected in public. That story then underlines how the white public's adversarial relationship was quite conditional and racialized when it came to anatomy. So as may be becoming clear, these racial theories in early American medical schools directed much of their attention to anatomy, dissection, and human remains. For example, antebellum racial scientist and medical professor Samuel Morton included racial skull measurements in his anatomy textbook. So too did Penn faculty William Horner and his successor, Joseph Leidy, in their lectures. The actual lectures they gave illustrate this further. In his anatomy lectures at the New York College of Physicians and Surgeons, Professor John Augustin Smith taught students about supposed racial differences in the cranium, going into depth on facial angles and cranial capacity. Smith had served in various capacities at Columbia's medical school. He first was the lecturer of anatomy from 1807 to 1813, which is when these lectures I'm about to talk about were given. He after that joined as the president of William and Mary, and then came back to be the president of Columbia's medical school from 1831 to 1843. In between his two, in short, Smith's influence is widely accepted in elite institutions of higher education above and below the Mason-Dixon line. Specifically, in his lectures, he asserted that Black and white people were essentially different and had been since the beginning of recorded human history. Facial angles, he told students, made Black people an intermediary between Europeans and monkeys. And this is a direct quote, and the capacity of the cranium of the European is also greater than that of the African is about 1/12 or 1/13. It's worth noting that in this early period, and we don't really know what happened, Smith was no polygenist. But it's not uncommon for folks like him who lived this whole period to kind of convert in the 1840s or 1850s, and he lives to 1865. So it wouldn't surprise me at all if he does make that shift, as I've seen other faculty with similar careers did. He exclaimed to his students that these racial differences could not be accounted for by any known cause. Black people became no lighter in cold climates, Smith explained, and whites were not turning Black in the West Indies. In short, Smith left unanswered where these racial differences came from, and to some extent, he allowed a door to be open that social intervention could potentially cause the perceived medical differences or solve the perceived medical differences. But in the real content, he's giving the same type of lectures as polygenists did decades later. From Smith's lectures, we can ask several questions. What did this education look like? How did medical students experience racial education? Did it also affect the treatment of Black people in the South, in the North? These aren't questions I can just answer from New York City records. So now I want to move, up and down the I-95 corridor to Boston, Philadelphia, and a little bit to Charleston, which, not exactly 95, but to get a glimpse of what is happening in peer institutions and quite literally what it might have looked like. Methodologically speaking, lecturers employed a visual style to teach the supposed differences that blended oral content with demonstration. Visual and tactile instruction was meant to make medical and supposed racial knowledge easy to retain and empirical. In the introductory lecture to his first session at Harvard in 1847, Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr. Plainly explained that his lectures would be highly visual. In fact, his motto was illustration. He told his students that anatomy was an inherently optical and tactile discipline, one that in most respects, students would learn more from the visuals than the rhetoric. Holmes' first point on the importance of visuals to anatomical lectures focused on retention. He believed that students could understand and retain the information better when visually presented. But the second power of a visually oriented anatomical lecture resided in observation's ability to render anatomical knowledge objectively real. And Holmes puts this plainly. He says, I have attempted, therefore, to render visible everything which the eye could take cognizance of, and so turn abstractions and catalogs of names into substantial and objective realities. Holmes used images of models and anatomical specimens as a part of a larger pedagogical approach to anatomy. And this is from a school in London, I think there's a lot of reason to believe that lectures would have looked like this at virtually any well-funded medical school, which is what we're talking about right now in the United States. So you can see the lecturer is down here. He's actually got human remains surrounding him on, like if I had a skull sitting here. And then all of these images, we know Holmes made enlarged images by commissioning an artist. Then you can literally see this hanging articulated skeleton. Essential to his lectures about racial differences are these images that surrounded him as he explained whites' supposed anatomical superiority. Holmes commissioned enlarged artistic reproductions of figures from prominent racial science texts like Harvard medical grads Charles Pickering's The Races of Man. Most visuals in Pickering's monograph were sketches of people that he encountered during the United States exploring expeditions, circumnavigation of the globe, the first time the US did it, from 1838 to 1842. And this pro-racial science book with maps of colors where the natural places of different races were supposed to be around the world is one of the first book productions of the Smithsonian also. Building on visuals, lectures also had tactile components. Anatomical objects were passed around the room. Skulls were displayed. Holmes even instructed students on how to use a craniometer depicted here. Both Leidy and Holmes' teaching careers, Joseph Leidy at Penn and Holmes' teaching careers also span the antebellum and postbellum eras. So we know that their racial pedagogy didn't really change with the Darwinian Revolution or the Civil War. Students also wrote about anatomical difference in their dissertations. Hailing from South Alabama, J. Ramsey McDowell arrived in Philadelphia in the 1850s as certainly a young man versed in all the racial prejudice of South Alabama's plantation districts. But his thesis showed the influence of his education and Joseph Leidy, his professor in particular. For example, McDowell was one of several students who noted in his thesis that Leidy told the class that there are more differences between Black and white people than lions and tigers, yet nobody ever claimed that lions and tigers were the same species. So in short, at Penn, the students are learning that Black and white people are different species based on their anatomies. As well as learning about racial science in a bustling northern city, McDowell was privy to a cosmopolitan set of racial scientists. He cites Agassiz, the famed Harvard ichthyologist, and deceased European luminaries such as Georges Cuvier and Petrus Camper, who literally invents the process of measuring facial angles. Comprised of half Southern students, schools like the University of Pennsylvania and Jefferson Medical College, and to some extent Columbia, not half, but did aspire to get Southern students. These bring together white male youth, women are excluded, of course, from across the Mason-Dixon line to learn racial science together. Not just that, of course, not even mostly that, but partly that. Polygenist ideas, though, I'm sure we can understand, are rife with contradictions, faulty premises, etc. And this was not lost on particularly Black commenters in the period. In 1854, Frederick Douglass gives a lecture at what becomes Case Western Reserve College to the students. And he's talking about this racial scientist, Samuel Morton's, who's the biggest kind of skull measurer in the US at that time, and how Morton will fetishize Egyptians, but the descriptions he actually gives of people that would be enslavable in the US South and on Morton's own terms. And so here's Douglass's own words mixed with Morton's as he's quoting him. He says, "A man in our day with brown complexion," and here Douglass is actually quoting Samuel Morton, "nose rounded and wide, lips thick, hair black and curly," back to Douglass, "would I think have no difficulty in getting himself recognized as Black." So racial medicine, though, also has practical applications for managing the healthcare and everyday life of enslaved people. I mean, this is what the perceived practical applications. Students universally asserted that Black people should be bled less in their dissertations. Recalling his time spent in Philadelphia, Mobile racial scientist and founder of the Medical College of Alabama, Josiah Nott, explained that UPenn professor Nathaniel Chapman told his students that Black patients, quote, "rarely bear bloodletting or depletion in any form," end quote. Nott also remembered that when treating Black people for pulmonary diseases as a student in the Philadelphia almshouse, that the prescribed treatment for pulmonary diseases, treatment focused on stimulants and quinine for Black patients instead of bloodletting. From his earliest days as a student in Philadelphia, Knott learned that beyond differential social treatment, physicians also must prescribe a different set of curatives. And interesting little coda about Knott is he actually kind of retired after the Civil War to New York City. Once slavery was abolished, Alabama to him was like an unlivable place. But he had many close friends in New York and came here and was like an active part of the New York Ethnological Society, and which was founded by one of his close friends. And so he ends up coming up here and living out much of his last years after the Civil War as a kind of gynecological specialist. In addition to therapeutic questions, medical students discuss the need to control enslaved patients as a part of everyday practice. Wary of enslaved people feigning illness to avoid work, medical practitioners devised brutal schemes to combat enslaved agency on plantations. In an undated notebook, one University of Pennsylvania student recounted a case where a fever had broken out on a Virginia plantation. Either not trusting the reality of the condition or not caring, this is the student's notes, the enslaver dug a grave in the middle of the field. He told the enslaved laborers that the next person to complain of the chills would be buried alive. And the student noted this as a success. Nobody else complained of health issues. Similarly, in 1850, Medical College of South Carolina student Moses McLeod explained that detecting enslaved people's false claims required physicians' total discrimination and acuteness. On constant guard for deception, McLeod in one case ordered a enslaved person to be whipped to cure his supposedly false claim of having a concussion. Moreover, as a part of their education, medical students in the North and South grappled with the most effective ways to manage enslaved people, with racialized terror being a legitimate option. And this, I just want to really quickly note, this is the part of the effect of marketing to Southern students. If you want students whose primary money comes from working on a plantation, kind of need to teach, especially as things get more charged and more charged, racial science and kind of these pro-slavery methods. But then you also have a room full of Northern students who are learning just the same thing. So it creates this interesting dynamic where what partially probably starts as a marketing thing actually, to some degree, indoctrinates all medical students across regional lines in this very extreme, by any standards, white supremacist medicine. For students, racial science had deep insights into how to control the United States multiracial population. Whether in New York or South Carolina, for example, one student argued that cool climates and freedom endanger the psychological health of African descendants. The student argued that the first possibility for why these higher rates of insanity, once again, these have been debunked, even in their own time, was that Black people were experiencing higher rates due to being put into social and intellectual contexts that exceeded their potential. Second, he argued it was simply too cold for them. The student, Mellichamp, contrasted high rates of mania among free Black people in the North, the allegedly sound mental health of Black people under Southern slavery. He explained all the ills which the slave may casually suffer from tyranny and injustice do not leave their impress upon him. No matter how violent the punishment, Mellichamp seemed to say, enslavers could only physically, not mentally, damage enslaved people. Sadly, a bloody civil war and the triumph of emancipation does not end this story and does not lead to the abolition of racist medical school curricula. In his 1874 thesis, University of Pennsylvania student and Philadelphia native, Hollingsworth Neal wrote about the anatomical peculiarities of Black people. While the nation had abolished slavery and Darwinists mostly had usurped polygenesis in elite international scientific circles, Neal's thesis closely resembled antebellum theses on racial anatomy, and he explicitly leaves the door open for a Darwinian explanation for these differences. In familiar fashion, he argued that Black people had longer forearms, also taught at Harvard, I know for certain, and narrower pelvises. He explained the frontal bones of the skull, besides having a smaller cranial capacity and a receding direction, have also the larger supraorbital protuberances, very suggestive of the formation in the gorilla. While historians often treat the Civil War as a breaking point both in terms of American race relations and the history of medicine, Neal's thesis illustrates that in terms of curriculum, not much had changed. Ivy League schools like Cornell, Harvard, and the University of Pennsylvania would also educate important eugenicists. And I would highly recommend coming out to your next speaker's talk on eugenics. She's amazing. David Starr Jordan, for example, was a Cornell-trained biologist from Gainesville, New York, who went on to become one of the most prominent eugenicists in the United States. And he was also the first president of Stanford University. In his 1911 book, The Education of Richard Roe, Discussion of the Principles of Eugenics, Jordan described black suffrage, presumably outside of the Jim Crow South, as an evil that will sooner or later become a festering sore in the body politic. So apparently disenfranchisement in the South was not enough. Jordan argued that Black people simply were not smart enough to participate in the electoral process. His legacy in the West was reminiscent of an antebellum story we've seen many times before, of an Ivy League trained physician going out to found or play a critical role in founding influential regional institutions. Now, Stanford probably wouldn't like being categorized like that now, but c'est la vie. In short, these alumnus of Ivy League institutions like Josiah Nott that I mentioned, like David Starr Jordan, become dispersed across the nation, further bolstering the influence of these institutions, but also tying racial science to them in pretty specific ways. In addition to training eugenicists like Jordan, with the founding of Cold Springs Harbor Laboratory in 1890, the New York City area would become a critical center of racial thought for the next century. Under the direction of Charles Davenport, the laboratory became an intellectual hub of American eugenicists, even housing the Eugenics Records Office. And while I don't think this is indicative of all employees of Cold Springs Harbor Laboratory in the last 50 years, but they also employed another person who ultimately got fired in the 2000s for being very racist, James Watson. Clearly, New York's research institutions would have an enduring rather than fleeting effect on how race is presented and thought of in medicine in the United States. So these are just a few examples from my book, which illustrates how early American medical schools like the New York College of Physicians and Surgeons helped enshrine the use of racial categories in medical practice. A focus on institutional racism allows us to unpack how these ideas persist after the deaths of their original authors. Ivy League anatomy faculty like Holmes, Leidy, as I mentioned before, taught more after the Civil War than before. Moreover, we know that the Darwinian Revolution does not change this dynamic. Thus, I think we can say that polygenesis did live on and live past its expiration date, officially speaking, through how physicians were continue to be trained to see Black people's bodies as anatomically distinct, even as they believed natural selection, not God, was responsible for these differences. Likewise, in the wake of this new racial medicine, physicians could claim that it was Black people's bodies, not their poor treatment on plantations or living in impoverished tenements, primarily in northern cities, that caused them to have lower life expectancies and higher mortality rates from everyday diseases and epidemics. In short, in Masters of Health, I argue that the institutionalization of racial thought in early America has helped justify or naturalize the persistence of health disparities across profound ideological and political changes in US history. During their earliest attempts at professionalization, medical faculty created and disseminated racial theories that claimed biological, not social, determinants were responsible for health disparities. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
So I want to open up the Q&A for those of you who are here in person, but also for our large audience online. I do ask if you're here in person to please use the microphone when you ask a question. You have to push the button until you get the green light so those who are online can hear you. Thank you. We actually have a question already online from Deborah Stead, who asks, how are racial differences in disease rates taught today?
So that's an interesting question, and not one that I honestly even feel like there's a shared agreement on. So I have lots of anecdotal cases that people tell me about. For example, I was giving a talk in my book last year at Yale, and a medical student discussed how in one of she was doing rounds and observing a birth where a physician told them that Black women and Asian women, which is kind of surprising that for some reason those two minorities are the same in this context, have more deeply seated spines, and thus you need to go deeper with your epidural, which I think if people, the New York Times in the last year did an interesting expose about hospitals with very high rates of mortality from more deeply seated epidurals. And then on the other hand, there's a very influential study of UVA medical students and grads that show more than 50% of these students and residents believed in essentialist racial differences like Black people being insensitive to pain, having thicker skin, thicker bones, denser bones. And these are actually all ideas that you can find in the 18th and 19th century at the same time as, same time as this kind of racial education is emerging. So a lot of what's interesting is that some of these ideas seem to persist, but there aren't a lot of people who acknowledge teaching them. So it's I actually say to me, it feels like somewhat open question of, you hear tons of anecdotes from medical students saying that a guest lecturer said this. There's a really interesting article that I teach my students from the New York Times about 20 years ago by Sally Sattel, who wrote a book called PCMD, How Political Correctness is Destroying Medicine. And the article is called I'm a Racially Profiling Doctor. But she kind of cops to believing still many of these different racial medical stereotypes, and says that not teaching them would be horrendous until we get personalized medicine. Then we can just, have a genetics test. But until then, race is our best proxy, is the argument, which I would completely disagree with, but I'll open up to any more questions. But my general sense is there's a lot of leftovers that seem to keep popping up, but in untraceable ways and then to some extent.
I want to leave time for those who are here, but we have another question online from Heather Cooper. Can you say a little more about how the curriculum addresses the changed status of enslaved to freed people? Were racial theories still being used to explain and manage African Americans as laborers, and did the view of them as patients change?
So that's an interesting question. To my sense, a lot of the racial theories try to actually, for different reasons, the people who are presenting these racial theories try and present free labor as unhealthy and enslaved labor as healthy. So they're different, but the same logic. So, a big part of this is, at least in the 1850s, northern states, particularly in the Midwest, are actually banning free people from coming to them. So as Southern states at the same time are saying that if you are freed from slavery, you must leave, a lot of northern states are increasingly saying you can't come. And they'll argue this on the basis of these things similar to what Mellichamp is saying about sanity. There's a heavily problematized, disputed census in 1840 that does show higher rates of mental health issues among Black people in the North, but it also shows that in some cases in towns where there are, I believe, more Black people supposedly insane than live in the town. So it's very much a problematized science, even in its own context. But so for the most part, the answer would be no. They argue that even if it would be better in most cases to force people to go to Liberia and work there, even as free people forced to go to Liberia are heavily encouraged to go to Liberia rather than stay in the U.S. North. So how that looks on the ground, I'm really not sure. But in terms of the medical theory, it's contradictory in its biological premises, and its social theory, it's pretty consistent, I guess would be the short answer. Yeah.
Thank you.
I'm an archivist and I always want to make our collections more accessible. And so I was wondering about your experience of researching these topics and your avenues of inquiry into archives and how well these collections were represented as being, uh, foundational or potential sources for your research.
So I could go on about this for a long time. I feel like this is in some ways uh, both a lot of the sources I'm using are really well trodden. The dissertation is not quite as much, although, but the short answer would be I would say until the last 10 or so years, most of these mainstream medical archival sources, unless they're about a Black person who's well known, like James McCune Smith, there's not a lot in there. I mean, and this is not a bad thing. My first time going to Harvard's medical school archives, and Harvard plays a key role in the first book, and the book I'm working on, very, very early stages on Harvard. So I've found two books basically in there. Uh, it's never really portrayed in that way. So now I should say that I think there's a lot of movement amongst medical school archivists to do this, but it does make for a really rich, for lack of a less awful word, opportunity for a researcher to find things that people really aren't looking for. For example, out of that same Harvard research, anthropologist Richard Price and I did an article about this Harvard professor, Jeffries Wyman, who goes to Suriname to collect specimens for the Peabody Museum. And everybody knew he had these travel journals, but no historian of slavery ever looked at them. So I'm looking at them and I'm going, this seems a lot like the people who are described in this really famous book called Willoughby's World. It's about a Maroon community in Suriname, probably the most famous Maroon community. Maroons are people who escaped slavery, formed their own autonomous community. The Samaka Maroons had a treaty with the Dutch government. The Dutch government literally gave them tribute, and there are very few sources about them. They did not let white people in very often for good reason. And there are no extended records of them in the mid-19th century until now, because Jeffries Wyman wanted to go see the Maroon community, wanted to go see kind of barbarous Africans would have been how he would have seen it. But we ended up doing a publication transcription out of this journal that shows us a remarkable cultural persistence from sources from the late 18th century to what's happening amongst the Samaka in the mid-19th century. So from that, and then these racial skull collections, the case of Stormon, which talked about in the Harvard and slavery documentary, and there a journalist in the Washington Post is writing about right now, is one of those kind of shocking horrors that is hard to live with, but that really hadn't been known much at all about until this period, whereas somebody like Sarah Bartman in France became very famous and repatriated. So I think there is for a long time, medical school archives have emphasized the professors. In some ways, I emphasize them as well as the kind of center of their records and the elite figures and the kind of breakthroughs. But what you find when you look at them, and I think we need to more and more kind of be telling people about these archives, is that there are social histories of everyday workers, enslaved workers, in the New York hospital records of everyday Black laborers who are suffering cataclysmic accidents and having to go to the hospital. So I think short answer would be, I think it's an exciting time to be a historian and a medical archivist right now, because there are a whole different set of stories in these archives that haven't been told. And I think, a lot of other folks are doing it at the same time and as me, but that was one of the things that early on I was told that I wouldn't find anything at Harvard. I think that's the bit of beginning of the anecdote I left off. And it's now, 10, 15 years of research on just that one school. So yeah, I think that's a great question.
We have another question online from Dr. Joseph Finns, who says, thank you for your talk. Can you relate the anatomy you described to phrenology, which was important in 19th century psychiatry, and whether any of the anatomical findings that were described were used to inappropriately characterize the psychology or personality of this population and instantate racial bias?
So that's a really interesting question, and one I expected to find more kind of like wedding together of phrenology and craniometry. But a lot of the craniologists don't want to be associated with phrenologists. Like they're like, those people are doing stupid skull science. There are some crossovers with phrenology, but like John Collins Warren, who is the collector of the Harvard collection, is very anti-phrenology. But there is a point in this earlier period where Charles Caldwell, who's a professor at Transylvania University, enemy of Benjamin Rush, as he slams him in his 1850 autobiography, like over and over. That's just hating other people who are mean to him, which is some of the fun of reading egomaniac's work. But Caldwell does become both. He writes the first full-length monograph published in 1830 in favor of polygenesis by an American physician. Becomes one of the founders of the University of Louisville's medical school. But he also tours around the South giving lectures on phrenology. And he doesn't necessarily in his book overlap, like he's not like doing like Black people have a certain ridge here that makes them more animalistic. But you do see a lot of the same type of psychoanalytical language despite not using phrenological methods. So one of their big weird arguments, they're really obsessed with sex a lot and interracial sex, which is probably not that surprising given what's going to happen in the second half of the 19th century. But they argue that Black and white people are naturally like find each other repugnant, which proves racial difference and different speciation. And some of them argue this is not phrenologically related, that they can't produce fertile offspring. And these are people who live in places like Mobile, New Orleans, with deep histories before the 19th century of interracial elites. I mean, like they're the gens de couleur in New Orleans are like the wealthy mixed race people who live in the Marigny now, what we now say is the Marigny. But so the short answer would be no, they think those people are idiots. The long answer is they say that, but when it really comes down to it, they seem to believe very similar things. They just don't think mapping the outside of the skull tells you much. It's more about cranial capacity. That being said, there really is a really excellent book on phrenology called of course, I completely forget it, but it's by James Poskett, Materials of the Mind, and it's about the international dimensions of phrenology. Like Indian physicians will create their own phrenological society in the late 19th century. And he does a very good job of showing its kind of longer history as a popular science. But in medicine, phrenology has an even shorter lifespan, I would say, in American medicine than polygenesis. About 10 years of interest, then a lot of the elite scientists are gone and think it's a load of crap. But all their other theories are just as bad. So we shouldn't give them much credit. But yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Willoughby, for this incredible talk tonight. We appreciate everyone for coming out despite the weather, and we hope everyone can join us on November 7th for our next lecture. So have a good evening and stay dry.
Thanks for everyone for coming. Yeah.